Honored that you're all with us. Obviously, this challenge, the one that caused this commission to organize, is one that's not going away. It's one we believe is generational. And we think today's conversation, frankly, is one of the most important conversations that's taken place about the fiscal future of America in 2020. And so without prolonging the start of the meeting, Senator Scott, I want to turn it over to you for some opening remarks about this issue that we, again, believe is a generational one. And then if we have a few minutes, we'll open it up to the commission for questions.
That was great. Well, I'll speak for a short period of time. That way we can have a couple of questions before I have to get off in about 5 or 7 minutes. I'm excited that you all will hear from one of the greatest minds in America, Trey Gowdy, in just a few minutes. He is indeed a fantastic person and just intellectually curious. You'll have a lot to listen to in just a few minutes. I'll say this, that there are lots of ways that we can deal with the debt that we have. There's no doubt that when you saw the 96-0 vote in the Senate for the 2 CARES packages, as well as basically a voice vote in the House that told you that what we were facing as a nation was an existential threat that had to be dealt with. I think we dealt with it in the first really 2 packages in an effective manner. Unfortunately, that added to the debt. Good news from my perspective is we are now stalling a little bit on this latest iteration of the CARES package. Good news because we still haven't seen the ultimate impact that a $6.5 trillion package has had in our economy. And I'll break that down this way. The 2 first packages really total a little less than $4 trillion. But when you look at within the package and you see the commercial facilities, the 13-3 facilities set up through Treasury, $450 billion that can be multiplied by 8 gives you another $3 trillion on top of the $3.8 trillion. So you're heading towards $7 trillion of liquidity and margin that we're bringing to the market that we have not really measured before we hopped into another package. There's no question that we saved 50 million jobs from my perspective. As the government shut the businesses down, it seems to be prudent that the government has the responsibility in that process to keep the liquidity in those businesses. That is not a long-term strategy. That was a short-term strategy. But really, that is not our problem. The biggest problem that we have from a debt perspective is the fact that we have structural problems within government, things like the Davis-Bacon Act. Seems like a small thing, started in 1931 to really help other businesses, not minority businesses, but help other businesses from a competitive standpoint by raising the wages and the contracts within the government. That really cost us tens of billions of dollars in and of itself. But there are structural issues like that throughout government. That's the regulatory regime is increasing the cost of so many things. We could eliminate that and over time save hundreds of billions of dollars. The real issue is 2 major pillars for us to deal with our debt. One has to do with our mandatory spending. We have to get our arms around Social Security, Medicare, veterans benefits. There's not much you can do about the interest on the debt except for quit adding to the debt. So that structural portfolio is something we have to deal with. And at the same time, what we need to do is continue to grow our economy. The pre-COVID-19 economy, the economic activity brought by the inverse relationship and the Laffer curve showed that lower taxes led to more revenues. In 2017, we passed it in December. 2018, we saw money to the Treasury actually increased by 3 to 4%. 2019, it did it again. So one of the most important ways for us to deal with our debt is to stop spending, turn off the spigot, as we say in the South, and B, we have to continue to grow our economy. You have to do both. If you're not doing both, you're really not tackling the debt. So with that, I'm happy to answer a couple questions.
Hey, Senator, let me take the first one. I mean, I think you're seen as one of the next generation leaders in Washington. You're speaking to some of our country's, I think, particularly from the perspective of young Americans, some of our greatest long-term challenges. Where does this issue, not just of the national debt as we see it today, $26 trillion, but the fact that we have no plan, we are full speed ahead with $2 trillion deficits over the next couple of decades. Where does that challenge stack up among several major long-term challenges the country has?
Well, it's an existential threat to our to economic mobility. Think of it this way: if our government is spending $4 trillion, we're bringing in $2.5 to $2.8 trillion, even though it's a little higher right now. But the bottom line is, if you're spending 35% more than you're you're bringing in. At some point, that debt accumulates, and then your service payments to that debt only continues to erode what you can do with those resources. Government does not create jobs. That's really good news, by the way, because we're terrible at it. So good news is we don't create jobs, but we do have to have a fertile soil condition for job growth and creation. The government needs to spend less money on servicing debt and more money on infrastructure. And I'm not talking about roads and highways. I'm talking about creating an environment that is conducive for Smith and Van team to work, where 330 million Americans all have an opportunity to participate in the economic realities of this country and lean forward. When you're not able to do that, what happens is China, as we've seen over the last several months, starts taking over from a global perspective markets that have been our allies and places where we've been able to see strong growth. The more we continue to be insular, looking inward, the less likely we are to remain the competitive giant that we need to be, the juggernaut of the world. So it really does have it's a strong threat to who we can be. And in my opinion, the way you get around that is by making sure that the conversation around debt reduction is a part and parcel of the future principles that the Conservative Party must embrace.
Senator, we're going to go to Rachel Neal, who's an entrepreneur and mom of 5 in Madison, Wisconsin. Rachel.
Yeah. Rachel. Hello, Rachel. Are you unmuted? I don't see you, and I don't hear you.
Now I am. Can you hear me okay?
Hey, Rachel. How are you?
Good. How are you? So
yes, ma'am. I'm doing well.
You've been talking a little bit about reducing expenditures, and I think we all recognize that there is a need to reduce government service to reduce the national deficit, but cutting many large ticket programs has proven politically unpopular. So you mentioned a couple areas where you think that we could be reducing our expenditure, like defense, Social Security, Medicare, education. Where do we start, or where do you think we'll be able to actually get some traction?
Well, thank you, Rachel, for the question. The first thing I'd say is that divided government is, unfortunately, in my opinion, necessary. I'd love to have the Republican Party control all 3 levers, but the fact of the matter is, for us to have the kind of tectonic shift that will be important and necessary requires divided government. We have that right now. So hopefully in 2021, we'll still have divided government, and we'll have a chance to put this to the forefront and make it one of our priorities. With divided government, then you have to have the yin and the yang that allows for us to have the type of healthy tension that leads to success. If I were having that conversation, I'd start with those folks who are below 10 years of eligibility towards Social Security. So 54 and below, I like to keep myself included in legislation that I would offer. And when you say to someone in their 40s, their 30s, and 20s that the Social Security system that we currently have is not the Social Security system that you'll have in the future, that in fact you may have to delay the onset of your full benefits by 6 months based on your age. Cynthia Lummis in the House back in 2012 or 2014 came up with a plan that would increase 42% solvency in Social Security by merely changing the age for younger generations, for younger folks. There's no longer an actuarially sound Social Security, so now we're using 75-year windows to see what it looks like. If we started with something like that, it would actually breathe more life and solvency and frankly reduce our long-term obligations to the nation. And that's a good way to start. The other thing I would say is that I am not opposed to opting in and opting out conversations on some of our mandatory spending, mandatory benefits. The fact of the matter is that the average worker today, my mother's 76 years old, and she loves going to work. It would be great if our private health insurance, it would take a structural change in the private health market as well. It would be lovely if our private health insurance companies were able to keep the folks on their health benefits longer than 65, that there's this mandatory requirement that you switch from private health care to Medicare at a certain age. Why not give our seniors options? Don't make them do it, because that would be impossible to get it passed. But by making that door an open door where they can walk through and stay on the job, keep their health care, it would increase the cost on the private sector, it would reduce the cost in the public sector, but in the end, we would have high quality health care and we would be reducing the burden long term on our nation. That is another way for us to take a look at that. And then we have other smaller programs that we would look into as well.
Senator, if we can take one quick question. Joe Zhu in Chicago, Illinois, very successful entrepreneur and investor, had a question, and then we'll let you go.
Sounds great.
Senator, thank you so much for taking the time with us today. And certainly thank you for your champion of the Opportunity Zone Initiative. That's actually a key initiative that an organization that I chair has actually created a macro program for impact investors for the White House Initiative for Asian Americans. My question on that, and specifically, you talk about the aspect of growing the economy and the importance of emphasizing that, especially for our low-income communities. How do we really foster entrepreneurship and business growth within those communities? Because right now what we've seen, at least from an anecdotal experience on the opportunity zones, is it's more big money, it's developers, it's people putting in the structure of it, but we have yet to see, in terms of my personal opinion, the internal and organic growth of entrepreneurship within those communities. Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, thank you very much. Joe, one of the things that we've seen throughout this, and sometimes I realize I talk really fast, I'm going to try to slow down a little bit here. Sometimes if we look at the current pandemic, what we've seen is about a 22% business failure throughout the country, about 32% among Hispanics, and about 42 to 43% among African-American businesses. So that in and of itself tells me that the pre-COVID conditions of those businesses probably where they were a little cash strapped or stretched. The HR departments are typically non-existent in small micro business units. That's a problem. So what I'm saying is that, Joe, for folks to be able to invest as entrepreneurs, you have to have a capital gain in order to benefit from opportunity zones. If you're not an entrepreneur, if you're not an investor, then you're not in a position to get involved in opportunity zones, because the benefit goes to those who have a capital gain to reduce, defer, or eliminate. So the first thing we have to do is start by examining the path towards small business, not for those folks who are currently in, but for the seventh grader, the sixth grader, who doesn't even see that as a path forward. I've met with my staff last week. We've been working on what I call America 2030. So we're looking at long-term over the next decade. How do we make sure that this inclusive economy that we produced pre-COVID-19 also increases the number of minorities who are entrepreneurs? The way that we do that is not by having an affirmative action plan. It's by having access to the economic system called capitalism. That is something that we have not sold very well to minority communities. If you look back at the Great Society, there was a fork in the road. Most of America continued straight on the path towards economic freedom using free markets and capitalism. And we said to those folks who were on the bubble or living on the fringes that for you all, a lot of disproportionately minority folks, we're going to give you this new form of the Great Society, which is government assistance. That really saw a plummeting of entrepreneurs and communities of color. The Great Society may have had good intentions, but the truth of the matter is it decimated small minority businesses as a result. So we had to take that fork in the road and we had to bring it back together so that there are more small business owners in minority communities. And one of the things that we have to do is we have to sell this concept of financial literacy in the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade in order for us 10 years later to have more entrepreneurs of color. If we don't do that, we don't get there. So part of the opportunity society that we're crafting in the America 2030, it has one word that is the most important word, and it's access. Access to opportunity, access to economic activity, access to quality education, and frankly, access to financial literacy. That is something that we've worked with the NFL, Visa to partner in middle schools and high schools throughout South Carolina. We're trying to spread that story throughout the country.
Senator, thanks for your time. As we let you go, just a thank you really to our whole South Carolina crew. Jordy Johnson and Robert Hughes are members of the commission from upstate South Carolina. Senator DeMint and William Timmons, Congressman Timmons were both integral to us getting this thing off the ground. So honored by your time today. Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir. God bless. Trey Gowdy.
Hey guys, we're going to transition here. And as you know, we did this last time, and I think to the minute we hit every session spot on. Today, I think this is a window into life, albeit life in a pandemic in Washington. Literally, Senator Mike Lee from Utah is, as I was just texted, running through the halls of the Senate to get back to us on time. So on a point of privilege, I'm going to pass this interview over to Lindsay Conrad, who's the Millennial Debt Foundation's new Director of Operations and Partnerships, and I see Senator Lee there. So Lindsay, you take it over. Thank you, Senator Lee, for joining us.
Great. Thank you, Weston, and thank you to the Commission for giving me this opportunity to join you all today. So I am absolutely honored to introduce a senator who I have looked to for sound, fiscally conservative leadership in recent years, and who, according to our very own Jonathan Bidlack's spendingtracker.org, has consistently been rated as one of the most fiscally conservative senators in our country. So, Chairman of the Joint Economic Committee, Utah Senator Mike Lee. Senator, can you hear us okay?
Yes, hear you fine. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for joining us. It's a true honor, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thanks for organizing this effort. And it really is a pleasure to be with you to talk about such an important topic. You know, we can't really talk seriously about getting our debt under control without addressing a few drivers, including and especially some of the main causes of the excessive accumulation of federal debt. These include the major spending programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and obviously our national defense costs, and our interest on the national debt, which is itself significant. Now, in 2019 alone, we spent $1 trillion on Social Security. We spent a little under $700 billion on defense and $644 billion on Medicare. Servicing or paying the interest on debt is becoming increasingly expensive. Debt's rising faster, far faster this year than economic growth, with interest payments making up the fastest growing part of the budget. Payments on the debt cost $389 billion in 2019. But that's not the scary part. The scary part involves the fact that it's only that low. So if you go back 20, 25 years when our national debt was like, 1/7, 1/8 of its current size, our interest on our national debt was roughly $200 billion a year. So why then, when it's at around the 27 trillion mark right now, is our debt service payment, our interest on that debt, only around twice that figure? Well, it has to do with Treasury yield rates, the rates at which we pay interest to those who have loaned us money, to those who have purchased U.S. Treasuries. Those are at all-time historic lows, and that party is going to last only for as long as people are willing to continue purchasing U.S. Treasuries at these all-time historic lows. Once that goes away, as soon as we reach the moment at which people are no longer willing to buy U.S. Treasuries at those rates, we will very quickly see our annual interest payment on our national debt skyrocket. As soon as they just go back to their historic average, we'll be looking at annual interest payments within a year or two of that triggering event in excess of $1 trillion a year. So we're looking at a moment when it won't be very long, if and when that occurs, before you start to see the annual interest payment starting to approach and eventually eclipse and overtake our total annual discretionary budget, the total amount of money that we spend on traditional government enterprises, things like defense, maintaining the operations of government, funding FBI agents, things like that. That's really scary. People have debated for a long time when this will happen. This has been something that I've followed basically the entire decade that I've been in the United States Senate. But there are some warning signs of late that really have me troubled. I was just talking to one of my colleagues this morning about this issue. He and I were discussing some of the things that could happen that would be bad. And if the data that I've got are correct, since March of this year, 58% of US Treasuries that have been sold since March have been purchased by the Federal Reserve Bank. Now, why is this? If this is the world's favorite investment, if it's the world's safest place to put money, why does the Federal Reserve Bank need to be buying 58% of US Treasuries? Well, I think it has a whole lot to do with propping up demand, making demand appear stronger than it is for US Treasuries that are paying at really, really low rates, at rates that make them, somewhere in the neighborhood of zero when adjusted for inflation. So anyway, these are all indications that we've got to get a handle on this. Now, while a long-term fix for Social Security, for Medicare and Medicaid is absolutely necessary, that doesn't excuse us from having to address the so-called discretionary side of the budget. That is, those things that are not part of entitlement programs, those things that are not already provided by law and funded by law. We have to have both of the above strategy. So some of the things that we ought to look to in that area include the fact that we have for far too long gotten ourselves embroiled in endless wars in the Middle East without a clear vision of victory or what it looks like. In some cases, getting involved in warlike conflicts without even authorization from Congress, in violation not only of sound fiscal policy, but also anything that could be justified morally or under the Constitution. Not only do these endless wars cost American lives, but they also cost the American taxpayers a lot of money every year. And that ought to be something that we are concerned about. I've worked tirelessly to try to end undeclared wars and to try to end those declared wars that don't at this point have a clear purpose or clear utility for the American people. Another area where I think we need reform deals with Social Security, disability insurance, and unemployment insurance. Under current law, some individuals in America are able to receive both Social Security disability benefits and unemployment insurance benefits at the same time. And yet, by definition, an individual cannot be disabled, meaning that they're unable to work, and also unemployed, meaning that they're ready, able, and willing to work, but entitled to unemployment insurance payments. Congress should agree that individuals should be disqualified from receiving both SSDI benefits in any particular month in which they are also receiving unemployment insurance benefits. The Social Security Disability Insurance Program provides benefits to more than 10 million American individuals at an annual cost of $146 billion. That's every year. The Congressional Budget Office gave a preliminary estimate that ending double dipping in SSDI and UI would save roughly $1.9 billion in direct spending over the next 10 years. Now that may sound like a drop in the bucket, and compared to the whole of what we're facing, it is. It still doesn't mean that this doesn't need to be done. This is one of the great impediments to our getting real progress in this area is the lack of consensus that that we need to cut in small and large places alike. And also that we need to, of course, take steps to ensure economic growth. I've got an amendment to S578, which is the Amyotrophic Lateral Sclerosis or ALS Disability Insurance Access Act of 2019. And my amendment would close this loophole and achieve those savings. Successful welfare programs are those that make poverty and unemployment more temporary rather than tolerable over the long haul. And Americans need policy that distributes their tax dollars properly. This reform would do exactly that. The reason why it's so important that we do these things, it's not just that we save money for the taxpayer, it's also that programs like these, if managed improperly, can actually lead to greater, more prolonged dependency on government and keep people locked in poverty over time. That's a big problem. So I think these reforms are important fixes to start with, and hopefully we can build on them and build momentum going forward. I'd be remiss here if I didn't repeat my my oft-repeated statement that we need structural spending reform. And I think one of the best pieces of structural spending reform that we could achieve is a balanced budget amendment to the U.S. Constitution that would require a supermajority vote in both houses of Congress in order to approve spending in any year in excess of tax revenues, or in excess of 18% of GDP, or to raise the debt limit, or to raise taxes. If you were to do that, you move the goalposts a little bit. You make it more difficult for Congress to send a bill to future generations. That would be better for all Americans, present and future. So thank you very much. I look forward to talking to you and working with you on these important topics.
Thank you so much, Senator, for those comments. I think we just have a couple minutes until we wrap up. And so I think we have time for one question here. From the great state of Kentucky, we have Asa Swan, who would love to ask you a question. Asa, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Lindsay. Senator Lee, thank you so much. It's great to have you. My question is just, what is your gauge on your colleagues' willingness to reform the budget process and try to address some of the systemic reasons that lead to more spending rather than less every year, like biennial budgeting and things of that nature?
Yeah. The best way I can describe it in the abstract is that by analogizing it to St. Augustine during his conversion to Christianity. He's reported to have uttered a prayer in which he said, "Lord God Almighty, please bless me with chastity, but not yet." He didn't want necessarily to have to start living yet. The commandments that he had been taught and that he, by that point, believed were correct, given from God and intended for his benefit. This is very eerily similar to the sentiment in Congress. If you talk to most members of Congress in either house, in either political party, nearly all of them will acknowledge that spending at this level in excess of what we bring in every year, year after year, just as part of the default plan, is a problem, that it's not sustainable, that it's going to cause problems. Where you see a lot of divergence of opinion is when they start talking about what to do about it, and especially if you start talking about things that could be done right now. You'll hear a combination of a lot of responses of how to get around it. The most common perhaps is, that sounds great, let's wait till we get past this next election cycle, because this next election cycle is going to determine whether we can do those things. And so it's always kept just a day or two out into the future. It reminds me of a joke that my brother used to tell me when we were little kids. I'm a few years younger than he is. And in the grand tradition of older brothers, he liked to mess with me. And he'd say, you know, how do you keep an idiot in suspense? And I'd say, I don't know, how? He said, I'll tell you tomorrow. That's very much the approach that Congress seems to be taking. And so I think the answer needs always to be now. Well, why postpone till next year what you can do now? I know it's politically difficult. Nobody wants to be the mean lawmaker who says we've got to cut, but we've got to redefine, we've got to reinterpret what we have allowed society, the mainstream media, much of the educational establishment, and much of the political establishment in both political parties to tell the American people, which is that nice equates somehow to spending more money that we don't now have and sending the bill to unborn generations or generations that have been born but are not yet old enough to vote, and reinterpret that to the fact that that's mean, not nice to do that. And one of the ways that we've got to start in that direction is by adopting permanent structural spending reforms like what we see with the balanced budget amendment, a statutory spending cap, and things like that. There's one other thing I would add to that in terms of something that we could do right away that wouldn't require passage of a constitutional amendment or even necessarily require passage of new legislation. If members of both houses of Congress and both political parties would stop accepting the way we've been passing spending bills and start demanding that each spending bill be the subject of debate, discussion, and an open amendment process, this would make a huge difference. I know we're out of time, but this one's important. Let me just explain this. I've got behind my desk, a few feet over there, you can't see it, but I've got a stack of papers that represent a spending bill, one of many that we've had. In this case, it was a spending bill passed in March of 2018 that we received on a Wednesday night through an email with an attachment to a PDF document. It was 2,232 pages long. I immediately opened it, shared it with my staff. We started reading through it because I knew that once they gave us a copy of it, they might move it fairly quickly. My staff and I worked through the night and into the next day, reading it, cataloging it, trying to digest it, figure out what was in it. The House of Representatives, I kid you not, passed that bill before lunch the next day. The Senate passed it in the middle of the night the following night. Both houses passed it without a single amendment being proposed and considered by members, the rank and file, and that bill was passed. This is unacceptable. The process itself leads to this sort of thing. Members are hidden from the process from the get-go, not told of the bill that they're going to be voting on, which always spends a whole lot more than what we're taking in. And then they're told you've got two choices. You can vote against it, in which case you will be blamed for a government shutdown, or you can vote for it, in which case you'll be praised by the media and by your leadership, Democrat or Republican, House or Senate. This is unacceptable. It's got to become part of what people are running on. People need to be running on this agenda of not voting for stuff that they haven't read and don't have an opportunity to amend as a matter of principle. That would also help things a lot. Anyway, thank you. And that's a great question, Asa.
Senator,
Great.
thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Honored to have
Thank
you
you
with
so
us.
much, Senator. So such an opportunity to hear from you and those comments. So I'm going to pass the baton back over to Weston, who I see has a special guest there.
I do. You know, we do Zoom webinars, and often this is so that we can be together but in different places. And you and I, Congressman Ribble, we're doing a Zoom, and we're also here together.
Yeah, we both live in Tennessee, so I had a chance to just get in my car and drive down and be with you in person today. Weston,
Well,
it's good to be here.
Thank you. It says a lot about my home state that former congressmen from Wisconsin come and live here. Others in the media are relocating here all the time. Popular relocation destination, particularly for Californians. That's just facts. These are just facts. So what we're going to do here, I've found, I've got a former member of Congress in my family. Former members have the privilege of speaking with quite a bit of candor. Fair?
Fair enough.
And so this panel here really is about you and former Congressman Trey Gowdy, who's obviously got a high profile and has remained active in the game, but talking about what, in hindsight, contributes to where we are in terms of $1 trillion deficits before a pandemic, what could be $2 trillion deficits after a pandemic. But let me go to Commissioner Jordy Johnson to introduce our other guest, and we'll get this thing started.
Thank you, Weston, and good morning, everyone. Thrilled to have Congressman Trey Gowdy with us today. as Weston said, a significant profile across the country, and would love to hear your thoughts, Trey, on the situation with increasing debt, exploding deficits, and how we've gotten here, and your thoughts on the situation in D.C.
Thank you, Jordy. Reid and I had a deal that he would handle economic issues and I would handle legal issues. So I'm guessing we've broken that deal. Reid,
Yeah,
you want me to talk about economics?
Yeah, no, it's okay. We'll all enjoy the commentary. Thanks, Trey.
Well, I thought what Tim Scott said was really instructive. And Reid, I'd be curious what your position is. I mean, looking back on it, the reason that we have deficit spending is because it's really, really hard to say no. And even folks who represent themselves as being fiscally conservative, they want other people's stuff to be cut, but they don't want their own stuff to be cut. Reid, you and I came in together that first summer we went home in August of 2011. Our job was to make the case for structural entitlement reform. And this is a district that used to be represented by Jim DeMint. So it's a really conservative district that Jordy and I live in. And I was okay in a courtroom at convincing people of things. I was an abject failure at convincing even conservative voters that we needed structural entitlement reform because they did not want it to impact them. So, why do we spend more than we bring in? Because folks want to cut everything except what impacts them. And when you talk about, I love Mike Lee. Mike Lee was one of my favorite colleagues. He's a really, really smart guy. I posed the question last night to a college class that I teach, how many of you want a balanced budget? But then when you explain to people, if you want to balance the budget next year, what that means, what you're actually doing with spending, then they lose interest in that. They want to balance the budget 20 years from now, but not next year. So why do we have deficit spending? Because that's really what the voters want. They just don't tell you that.
I would agree, Trey, but we don't really give the voters a choice either. And so one of the problems that we have, quite frankly, is that we need to give voters a choice. And right now we're giving them government at about a 40% discount. And if we would change the paradigm and say, no, we're going to set taxation near or close to what we believe expenses should be. So, for example, Republicans love to spend money on defense. If we need to make a case that we need to build the F-35 or new frigates like they did up in my congressional district, then we ought to be able to say to the taxpayer, and here's what it costs, and here's the impact on you personally, and this is the new tax rate that we have to impose. If we want to build new roads, rather than borrowing $75 billion a year, because that's the shortfall on the gas tax, we would say, well, we need to raise the gas tax so you guys can have good roads, bridges, airports. But we never impose the moral hazard on the American citizen as well. And if at some point we would actually tax for the government we're giving the American people, they would actually join us in saying, no, we'll help you choose. We don't want that. But we don't even give them that choice. We just decide to go to the lender, or in this case, to the Federal Reserve, to print more cash. And we can't resolve that issue. And it's especially true. You mentioned entitlement spending. I had the exact opposite, Trey. When I did a whole series of town halls, it led me to write a bipartisan piece of legislation to fix Social Security. But to do that, you have to be willing to tell both sides, Republicans and Democrats, my bill has got stuff for both of you to hate. We have to raise revenue, and we have to change the benefit structure. If you do that, you can find the common ground.
Hey, let's talk about process for a minute. I know both of you, you were a prosecutor, Congressman Gowdy, you were a successful business person. This job of serving in Congress, both of you were good at it, but you didn't stick around to do it for a whole long time. Talk about, and I think just hearing both of you explain and rationalize as you were leaving, why you were leaving, that the dysfunction that people across the country have come to dread about Congress was part of your decision. It also seems more than ever that dysfunction, and you mentioned the budget process when Senator Lee was talking, that the way the sausage is made here is not the way it used to be. It's not the way it ought to be, and it's directly contributing to massive deficits that we can't even begin to push back on.
Well, the budget, and the American people are going to be discouraged to hear this, the budget's fake. I mean, that's why they don't pass budgets anymore. I had written a piece of legislation to fix that problem. I wrote it with Paul Ryan when he was chairman of the Budget Committee. And yet, my last year in Congress, we had 237 co-sponsors in the House, 35% Democrats, 70 or 65% Republicans. We had 60 votes in the Senate. I had a letter from President Obama saying he would sign the reform. It included biennial budgeting and included enforcement triggers on Congress to do the appropriations the way Senator Lee said. Members across the board wanted it. And neither Speaker Boehner or Speaker Ryan, who was a co-sponsor on the legislation, helped me write the legislation, would even let it come to a vote. If you can't legislate, why be there?
I mean, is that your experience? I mean, Congressman Gowdy, in your own respect, you had carved a niche that was rare and influential. But increasingly, Congress is run by just a few people who have an incentive to protect their power.
Well, I mean, it is a leadership-centric body for sure. But the reason I left, and let me just say right now, if all my colleagues had been like Reid Ribble, I'd still be there. He was and remains one of my favorite memories of the time I was there because of his authenticity. He didn't need the job. I think he viewed it as public service. The reason I left, Weston, is because, you know, in a courtroom, there are rules and there are procedures. And the process matters every bit as much as the result. I mean, we throw out confessions if police don't do things the right way. We suppress evidence if the search warrant is defective. In politics, the only thing that matters is winning. And my guess is if Boehner were to, well, he's not up yet, but if Boehner were up and he were to join us, or Paul, they would say, well, it would have jeopardized us keeping the majority. Winning is really the only thing that matters in politics. I also want to add to Reid's point that we don't actually really make the voters make the choice. Reid, maybe I missed it. I didn't hear any discussion of deficit or debt. I really haven't heard them in the last two State of the Union addresses. So I don't even, I mean, I'm glad that we're talking about it today, but it seems to have gone down as a political issue. It used to be something that Republicans talked a lot about. I haven't heard it in the last couple of State of the Unions unless I missed it.
No, you haven't missed it, Trey. The fact of the matter is we love to talk about the debt and deficit when the other party's in power. We hate to talk about it when our party's in power because that means we have to say no to voters on things that they might want. Or we have to say, well, if you want those things, you have to pay for it. And we don't want to do that. And so, you know, it was fascinating to me to watch how, you know, when Trey and I went in, we passed the Budget Control Act, and that was the only piece of legislation that actually reduced spending in the last decade.
Right. And
as soon as Republicans took full control, they got rid of it. And so it's just how it's been working, and it goes to show the brokenness. And I remember kind of getting called to the carpet by the speaker because I voted no on a rules vote. And when you're in the party in power, you're supposed to always vote for the rule. But they had just beat us up about passing a budget that was really a tough budget vote to take. And then literally 2 weeks later, they put in the rule that they were going to waive the budget. And this is a rule vote, is a procedural vote that everybody in the majority automatically votes yes on. But as soon as they said we're waiving the budget, I voted no. And I started voting no on a lot of rules because they kept waiving the budget, which told me that at the end of the day, they really weren't serious about following those numbers. They wanted it as a talking point.
Weston, let me amplify one thing that Reid said, because I think it's really important, particularly for your generation of leaders. I mean, Reid made the point that if you put specific things on the ballot, you may get a different result. You know, Jordy and I live in Spartanburg County. If you put on the ballot an increase for the sheriff's department, I think it would pass 85-15, 80-20. People are willing to spend more for public safety. They may be willing to spend more. We had a $25 vehicle tax, which passed. We had a local referendum on building a new high school that passed. But until you can have a serious debate about the role of the federal government versus the state government versus local government, and then have a serious debate about what the role of government period is, juxtaposed with the role of the individual, then I don't know that you're going to have the kind of clarity that Reid laid out. And right now, politically, the easy thing to do is say, sure, government can solve that problem. We'd be happy to solve that problem no matter what it is. I mean, think of the issues, whether it's domestic violence, whether it's the Children's Advocacy Center, whether it's roads and bridges. Those things could and arguably should be done at the state and local level. But Congress is afraid to make the case that, yeah, that's a great idea. It's just not a great federal idea. And I don't know that the jury wants to hear that. And when I say jury, I mean voters.
Hey, Trey, how do we get the jury of our peers more engaged? I mean, everyone on this call are predominantly millennials. We're the people who are going to get stuck with this bill eventually. It's really exciting to talk about spending and building new high schools, building new courthouses. How do we get, cutting spending, deficit, not sexy? How do we get millennials like Watts and Gowdy engaged to care about the deficit that's going to come due on our watch?
Well, with my son, Jordy, you got to take his golf clubs away from him. I mean, right now, he's much more concerned about the U.S. Open that starts tomorrow. I think I did not have success. I was interested to hear that Reid did, which means he probably would have been a better prosecutor. I didn't have a ton of success in our own hometown, Jordy, convincing older folks to postpone their retirement 6 months so their grandkids would have a solvent Social Security. So whether that's a reflection on human nature or not, I don't know. I would start with that fundamental, what is the role of government? What do you expect from government? Do you expect government to handle your retirement, your health insurance, access to education? I mean, what are the limits of what you expect government to do? Because if you're a millennial or you're in your 30s and your 40s and you have a vast, expansive view of what the role of government is, then you're going to always have deficit spending because you can't tax your way to meet those expectations. If I were starting all over again, I would stick to trying to force folks to explain what they expect legitimately from government. Because until I know the answer to that question, I can't budget properly.
Yeah, well, a lot of the reason we're here today, part of the reason that the Millennial Debt Commission was formed, was inspired by the work of Dr. Tom Coburn and Congressman Gowdy. To your point, I mean, one of the conversations that we want to steward here is what is the role of government? And that's not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's just to ask an important question. I think there's probably a lot of people, Reid, I suppose you would agree with me, suggesting that civics education is at an all-time low. When we say the word federalism, I would say
civics understanding is at all time.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Hey, I think we have time for one question. Cam Duty is actually a fellow Tennessean, chairman of Bellhop. Cam, go ahead.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, I mean, it seems to me we're in a situation where this problem is so big that it's almost too big for any one person in politics to take on. Incentives aren't there. If everybody agrees in the House and Senate that this is a problem, but the voters don't seem to care about it right now, how do we get to the point where politicians actually have incentive to sticking their neck out and saying, this is something that I'm going to fix or, run a campaign on?
I think if you were serious about it, if the voters really wanted to fix it, I mean, if they really wanted to fix it, you have to compensate members of Congress different. The incentives are wrong. The incentives are exactly upside down. And so here, I'll tell you what, would you make a trade of $435 million for $100 billion in savings? So, change the incentives on how you pay members of Congress. Put the incentive that for every $100 billion or $200 billion that they save, they get paid more. And what you're going to find is all of a sudden everybody's a budget hawk.
Well, you can tell that I'll never run for office again by the candor and the honesty of the answer I'm about to give you. But with a few exceptions, I mean, and I did honestly consider Reid to be a leader, both privately among his colleagues and publicly. But he also left. I think politics right now reflects. It doesn't lead. It reflects. And if you want to change Congress, you have to change the mindset of the people who do the electing of the members of Congress. And I know that's not popular. It's much more popular to blame the institution and say that we're fine. But until we get our heads around what we legitimately expect from government versus what our own responsibility is, then I don't think you'll see fiscal restraint when it is absolutely forced upon members of Congress, because politically it's more expedient to spend than it is to cut. I mean, Mick Mulvaney is a perfect example. I mean, Mick loved to cut things. There's nothing Mick wouldn't cut. He'd cut Special Olympics. He'd cut the Girl Scouts. And he wasn't terribly popular with the outside groups and with all of his colleagues. So, I mean, he was fiscally consistent, but you don't make friends by advocating for cuts.
Yeah, this is why we need Trey Gowdy back in Congress.
I know. By the time it's all said and done, Congressman Gowdy, we may have all recruited you back into this business. Hey, thank you.
I can't afford the alimony.
Fair enough. We're going to go get lunch later, but thank you guys for bringing a unique perspective. I'm going to pass it back to my colleague, Lindsay Conrad, but I'll say this about our next guest who's going to wrap us up here in the first hour. I think all of us in whatever discipline, whatever lane of life we run in, the ultimate goal is to be a one-name star, Oprah, Kobe. And the truth is, if you talk debt and deficits on Capitol Hill for the last 2 decades, Maya is the expert. And so we're honored to be joined by Maya MacGuineas, and I'll let Lindsay formally introduce her, and you guys take it away. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Weston. So Maya MacGuineas is the president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. And as Weston said, an extremely well-respected commentator and leader on fiscal issues. Maya, we are thrilled to have you here today as an incredible voice on the national debt, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. That was a very nice introduction. I am thrilled to be here with you guys. Can you hear me okay? Yes? Because I've got like some iPhone, Zoom, multiple things going, and tech is not my strength.
We can hear you great, Maya.
Awesome. I'm thrilled that you guys are doing this commission. I am thrilled that you all are part of this. I got into this issue just because the more I learned about it, the more I couldn't walk away in my 20s. And despite the fact that I've been working on it ever since, and the debt has grown by trillions and trillions and trillions. So, you know, draw the correlation that you want to. I still am so impassioned and just feel really strongly about the importance of this issue and think that you guys can have an incredible impact. So very excited about this project. Let me go quickly through a couple thoughts and mainly we just chat. Obviously, we're in really bad shape overall. You all know that. But the fact that we entered this economic crisis with the debt as a share of GDP, the highest it has ever been other than just after World War II. The fact that we are going to break that record in a couple of years, and that the debt is growing faster than the economy forever, and that interest payments are so significantly large, they cost $1,000 per taxpayer per person in this country every single year. There's just so many reasons that we are in a far worse fiscal position. Put COVID aside, because this is a time where we should, and it's understandable that we're borrowing, but aside from that, we are in a fiscal position that is so weak and leaves us so vulnerable, primarily because we are politically unwilling to either pull back on that spending or pay for the spending that we do. And it boils down to nothing much more than we want to spend a lot of money, we don't want to pay the bills, we want to pass it on to the next generation. And your voices will be tremendously influential in all of this. It really does matter for a number of reasons. One, economic, that this is going to be a huge wet blanket on economic growth. And because of the aging of society and the retirement of the baby boomers, we have headwinds against us in terms of growth already. We really need to get the debt to a point where it is not making that situation worse. Second, it is a huge drain on the budget. We will, as a divided nation ideologically, always disagree about the size and shape of government, but all the money we're spending on interest payments is a waste, and we can't even like squabble about should that money be for spending or tax cuts. That's just going out the door. And oftentimes when it's going overseas, it's going out of the economy. Third is you need to have a strong fiscal balance sheet so you're prepared for emergencies. And if the past 6 months have shown us anything, it's that emergencies do come along, both in the form of a pandemic and a recession. And it's the toolbox that you need to have full, just like the Fed needs to have its tools, fiscal policy needs to have its tools to fight these. We are weak because we are ill prepared. But finally, and in a couple hours, I'm hosting an event on cybersecurity. I think the biggest reason to care right now is our fiscal position is one of our single biggest vulnerabilities in this country. And we have so many new challenges on the horizon. You will be working and bringing, entering into the prime years of your working and family life and all of these things at a period that is so much more complicated and where the pace of change is so much faster than any of us have ever dealt with before, you need to have a strong fiscal balance sheet so that you can respond. And I am really worried about the threats on the horizon. So let me issue one warning. This is hard work and nobody likes the message. When you tell the truth, and you have to tell the truth, because a really important piece in all of this is having the credibility of really understanding the issue and being honest about it, but nobody welcomes the issue. And that's not entirely true. Behind the scenes, people do understand it. Members of Congress do understand it. There are some exceptional leaders. And I will say, watching Reid Ribble develop a Social Security plan and get a lot of people on board with it was something remarkable. And there are a lot of members like that. But you have to tell the truth and beware of free lunches, because it is a moment where everybody is selling as many free lunches when it comes to fiscal responsibility as possible. And this is hard, and you do have to make choices. One of, I think, my biggest recommendations is think about ways, Reid talked about this a little bit, but to put budget constraints into the whole exercise, where if you want something, you actually have to pay for it. Cutting taxes is easy. Cutting spending is hard. But if you link spending to how much it costs, we have a tool called Is It Worth It you can look at. People will then be more honest about making the kinds of choices they need to think through. So I will stop there, but I just really want to thank all of you. And Weston, I want to thank you in particular for building this whole important effort. You guys are going to have real impact. We are going, once we get through this moment of fighting the recession, we are going to have to pivot really quickly to debt reduction, and you all are going to have a voice that we have really been lacking for quite some time.
Great, thank you so much, Maya. We probably have time for one question, and if I can be selfish and take that question, I'd love to ask you something. So this is obviously a long-term issue that we have to deal with, but can you talk a little bit about the short term a bit and what legislative priorities should be considered for 2021 or more short-term thinking?
So the short-term thinking isn't about debt reduction, it's about preparing us for debt reduction. We should not try to balance the budget or reduce the deficit until we get through. We're in a three-part moment. We have to get through the virus, we have to get through the recession, then we have to get through the debt. The issue is we are likely going to forget that third part. There was a question that I think Justin asked earlier in the chat part, and it was, has anybody talked about how you attach to any COVID economic packages a way to pivot to this issue down the road? And there's a really important effort by 60 members in the House, 30 Democrats, 30 Republicans, led by Jody Arrington and Scott Peters, which says any future economic packages should include the commitment that once the economy is strong enough, we will pivot to dealing with the debt. So I think that's really important. One of the things that they highlight, which is a really good approach, I think, is the Trust Act, which is bipartisan, bicameral. It sounds pretty easy because it's commissions, process, budget caps, they're all easy. The hard things that are real are what we really have to do. We have to raise the retirement age. We have to think about means testing. We have to look at the $1 trillion of tax breaks in the budget. We have to control healthcare costs. Like, there are real choices to be made. But our political system is a disaster right now in terms of getting anything done that's difficult. So the Trust Act takes a look at each individual trust fund that is going to become insolvent: Social Security, disability, Medicare, and highway, and would have independent commissions to focus on those. The point that I bring that up is we can put that in place today. We shouldn't cut spending or hike taxes during a recession, but you can put in place these process changes, particularly ones that will phase in changes gradually as the economy is stronger, and get a jump on that today. That would be really important. One other suggestion I would say is what we can do is we only have a few more weeks before an election, and we know that debt's not going to be front and center, but we can try to get this a discussion, a question, debates, something that is brought up, because it's really important for us to be able to create some kind of a mandate now so that when the economy is strong enough, we can take all the measures possible to start to get the debt under control.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time and also for your leadership. This is really an important issue. And so I know the commission is excited to work with you and your organization in months and years to come. And so at this point, I'll pass it back over to you, Weston.
Thanks again, Maya, and grateful on a day where your organization is having a conversation with a shared friend of ours in Congressman Mike Gallagher, that you'd take the time to be here, and look forward to working with you on an ongoing basis.
Thanks, you guys. Anything I can do to help, count me in.
Thank you, Maya. Hey, as we go right into 11 o'clock, anybody who needs to take a coffee break, just take yourself off camera and we'll keep moving. Next up is a guy I met a couple years ago in Houston, Texas, who's really proven himself to be, I think, a good example of what a millennial legislator will look like. Dan Crenshaw is known as a Navy SEAL and a war hero. I would say I really come to respect him as a thoughtful policymaker and a person who's taken some deep dives, started a podcast, interviewed MacGuineas on that podcast. Congressman Crenshaw, we're honored to have you here and look forward to hearing your millennial perspective. We believe that debt and deficits, the fiscal future of the country, is now a generational issue. And so if you want to make some opening remarks, and then we'll open it up to the commission for questions. We're honored you're joining us.
All right, I'm unmuted. How you guys doing? Glad to see everybody here. Looks like we've got a great group. I'm sure one day we can maybe do it in person. The debt issue has to be taken on by millennials because it actually affects us, but millennials don't know that, so that's the problem. And our Republican voters aren't that interested either. That's the dirty little secret. This is fundamentally a cultural problem, and it's always talked about as a problem in Washington. It's not. Problems in Washington are reflective of the general public. We are representatives after all, and I don't like people don't like hearing that because people view Congress as dysfunctional and full of corrupt, self-centered, self-interested people. But in the end, every one of those people has to get reelected. So they do answer to the people in one form or the other. And we haven't had an adult conversation in this country about debt. People like to pretend, I've noticed, voters, they'll say the debt matters to them. But if you talk about the things driving the debt, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, they don't want to have that conversation. And so there is this cultural impetus to allow yourself to be bought off by government promises. This is not a policy problem. This is a cultural problem. The policy solutions are somewhat simple. Social Security is incredibly simple to solve. It should be means tested. We should raise the retirement age. You can imagine some changes, some tweaks to the way it's funded, and you could put it on a much more fiscally sustainable path. Medicare, a little bit harder to solve because healthcare prices have to be solved, but if you shifted towards more of a Medicare Advantage type system for the entirety of Medicare, you'd probably see a lot of cost savings there. And again, means tested. George Soros and Bill Gates don't need access to subsidized Medicare, do they? These again simple solutions. But now where Washington does screw up is as soon as you even talk about this stuff, Democrats will light your hair on fire, telling the public how you want to cancel their benefits. And everybody feels very entitled to these benefits. They don't like that you call them entitlements, but they feel entitled to them. It's a very odd conversation I have with voters. And Democrats are happy to twist the truth in order to ensure that we never have that adult conversation. So the reality is I think these programs go insolvent, and then we actually take a hard look at them. And what Democrats want to do, and the reasons millennials really have to get in on this, because millennials like to vote for Democrats. Why? I don't know. Some sense of moral authority, I think, that the Democrats make millennials feel good about themselves, good about their sense of equality and justice and fighting for the little guy, right? And this makes you feel good, so you vote for this political party. But as it turns out, this political party does not have your best interests in mind. Their plan to get these programs solvent is raise your taxes and only raise your taxes and then transfer that directly to seniors. by actually increasing benefits for seniors. This is literally their plan. It's called Social Security 2100. It does make Social Security solvent by massively increasing young people's taxes. So this is immoral because if I didn't know anything about two people except their age, and I had to guess which one was wealthier, well, the best indicator of wealth is somebody's age. It's like 10 times more likely that or 10 times more wealth on average, I think, for somebody in their 60s versus somebody in their 20s and 30s. So it's not the wrong thing to do would be to have a direct transfer of wealth from that young person trying to make it to the older person. And this probably helps explain why so many millennials, because millennials intuitively understand this, that boomers have voted themselves increased benefits for decades. Now, instead of demanding that those benefits get reined in and put on a sustainable trajectory, millennials, unfortunately, have instead gone a different direction. They've demanded their own benefits. This is where you hear the nonsense about canceling student debt and free this and free housing and free healthcare, all free everything, right? Because if they got free stuff, I want free stuff. So it goes back to the culture, though. When you think like that, that's a cultural problem. That's a you problem. And it's manifested in a universal way in our country, where we've become a country full of people asking what the government can do for us, as opposed to asking what we can do for our country. The old JFK line. That's the cultural problem. That's what's causing our debt. It's not some gridlock in Washington. It's not some inability to think through the policy. It is very simply a cultural problem. Americans have to actually want it. So I appreciate what you guys are doing, because that's where the conversation has to start. People actually have to care and refuse to be bought off by false promises of more stuff, right? And, de Tocqueville said the end of our republic would be when politicians figured out they could buy people's votes with their own money. And it turns out politicians figured that out a long time ago. The Democratic Party's platform is effectively that it is their entire platform to buy you off with services. The Republican platform is an emphasis on how, a sense of solving problems within a set of limiting principles. But that's hard to sell to people who just want stuff. And so we got to solve these cultural problems. And I hope that's what the focus is. I think it should be for millennials, because again, the American people have to want it. So I guess we can take questions. I know we don't
Hey, Congressman, we'll go first to Joe Zhu in Chicago, Illinois. He's got a question, and then right after him, John Novak in Tampa. Joe, go ahead.
Great. Congressman, thank you so much for your time today. It's an honor to be on this call with you. My question is in regards to essentially the devaluing of the dollar. Last week, famed investor Jim Rogers, whom I would actually consider as probably one of the most prolific global investors of our time, talked about essentially the dollar that continues to go on this path in the U.S. government. The probability that the dollar becomes the world's most dominant currency diminishes significantly. Can you talk a little bit about the national security threats and ultimately what that would mean if the dollar became secondary? I know that China and Russia are engaging in what they call quote unquote de-dollarization practices. And what does that mean overall if we continue down our path?
Well, I mean, this is outside the area of my expertise, but I mean, I think it's bad, obviously. And I think the problem is we don't know what it would mean because it's never happened. So we don't know when the tipping point is on too much debt to GDP ratio. We don't know when the dollar tanks. And, because fiscal conservatives have been saying that too much debt is bad for a very long time, at 30%, 40%, 50%, 60%. Now it's 100%. And everybody's like, well, you said it would be bad at 30%, but it wasn't. We don't have any inflation. The dollar's still primed, and still strong. So everything's going fine. And it becomes harder and harder to actually persuade people to think more responsibly about this, because you won't know when the tipping point was until it happens. And I mean, there's of course national security implications there. Can we even fund our own debt and our own excessive spending? So national security would be integrated with our economy and our livelihoods. of course. So it touches everything that we do.
John, go ahead.
Thank you.
Congressman Crenshaw, thank you so much for the time and your leadership. It seems that our national debt has skyrocketed to a point it's going to take bipartisan efforts in order to pass meaningful reform to attack the subject. That being said, we hear a lot about entitlements from Republicans and we hear about military spending from Democrats. Is there any low-hanging fruit that we have where the two parties actually agree right off the bat and we can start attacking the problem?
No, there's not. Just to answer your question simply. Just the numbers are very clear on this. So the Democrats have gotten off the military spending a little bit. They're more concerned about the tax cuts. They claim that because we have tax cuts, tax cuts a couple of years ago, that's why we have a big debt. The truth is, using the trajectories of debt from a couple of years ago, the debt was going to be about $30 trillion in 10 years, and with the tax cuts, about $31 trillion in 10 years. So obviously, it's not the tax cuts, right? And as a percentage of GDP, revenue continues to rise. After the tax cuts, we had record amounts of revenue. Would it be more if we tax people more? Yeah, but that's not the government losing money. Democrats believe that's the government losing money. No, that's the American people getting to keep their own money. See, they have a very different perspective on what it even means to tax people. So there's a completely different set of philosophies there. You have to understand that when you're talking to a Democrat. Discretionary spending isn't really increasing. So the discretionary spending would be military spending and all the other three-letter agencies that we fund every year. It's not really increasing as a percentage of total spending and GDP. The only thing that's skyrocketing as a percentage of GDP and total spending is mandatory spending, which is entitlement spending. So there is only one way to actually get control of the debt, and it's entitlements. It is the biggest thing in the room. Because you could shave off a few billion from the defense budget, and it would be meaningless. And you could do the same thing with all discretionary budgetary items. And people like to fight about it in Congress, but ultimately it's useless. It's a useless conversation as it pertains to the long-term debt. The only thing we can have a conversation about regarding the debt is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid.
Congressman, one of the things you've done well, and I don't think your harshest critics would take this away from you, is that you've engaged a lot of millennials and even Gen Zers in this process. There's a couple million people who follow you on Instagram, and I assume they're not in their 70s. How do we begin to talk productively with millennials so that they think about this issue? It's always been interesting to me, for example, if you compare it to climate change. I think within millennials, there is some doubt that our parents did all of this right, that they made all the right decisions. Well, that same doubt certainly exists in my mind, like father of three, 33-year-old, but it doesn't seem like it exists, or this is even a subject that a whole lot of millennials are thinking about. I think a productive first step in the conversation is to sow some seeds of doubt that our binge, this deficit spending experiment that the country's been committed to for 2 decades, wasn't really the right thing to do. How do we change the messaging there generationally?
Again, it's a cultural problem. The problem I see when you have that conversation with somebody is they might acknowledge that it's bad. They just don't care because they've been taught to be resentful and entitled. That's what's driving these forces. And so, that's a much more difficult psychological state to reverse. Hey, stop being resentful. Start being responsible. Start thinking about the holistic problem here. People don't care. People are focused on their problem. And they see other people with stuff, and so they want the stuff because they've been taught that resentment is a virtue. So the problem goes so much deeper than just presenting the facts. And I would show this gets to some of the themes in my book, right? Like the way we've reversed virtues in this country. And started to advocate for the wrong things, where it's now considered virtuous to be a victim and to be resentful and to demand things as if you're entitled to it. This is now, people cheer this now, right? So this is a deep cultural problem. And so the message to kids and to millennials is, hey, if you're demanding, if you're waiting for somebody to do something for you, you're just asking them to have power over you. That's all you're asking for. And it's un-American. You should want something better for yourself. So the conversation just goes much deeper, unfortunately, than just presenting them the facts and showing them the debt levels. This is not persuasive to regular people. There needs to be a deeper cultural shift.
We'll squeeze in one more question here. Nick Mako is a co-founder of Legacy Box. Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman, for talking to us today. My question, I mean, as I think about this issue, I think about the movie Amazing Grace, and I think about Wilberforce trying to change the culture to think of the slave trade differently. And what's weird about that movie is that, or that story, is that it ends with some kind of strategic maneuver that they do at the end to get the votes needed to abolish the slave trade. So I guess my question is there any maneuver? Is there anything, change in incentives, something strategic like that could shift this trajectory other than cultural change? Yeah, that's the question.
No, I mean, you'd have to get some really bold Democrats to allow us to have the conversation, because Republicans will try to have the conversation and then and Democrats immediately say, well, they want to just cut your Social Security. I mean, President Trump talked about a deferral on payroll taxes, and the Democrats even took that to say he's cutting your Social Security. I mean, this is how, so again, it's mostly the American culture fault, but obviously there's things in politics here that take advantage of that fault in thinking and that ignorance and use it to their political ability. So it would really take bipartisanship to say, hey, this is actually a problem and we actually have to solve it regarding entitlements, and we're not going to snipe at each other while we're working through it. But the state of politics right now is not that, unfortunately. There is no secret smoking gun. It's the hard work. It's again, millennials have to demand it. Politicians have to be rewarded for it via re-election if they actually take the bold move to do it. That's the truth. And that doesn't mean they're corrupt or cowardly. It means they're representatives. Like if you're doing things that cause your voters to vote against you, then in theory, you're not really representing them, even though you might be trying to do the right thing and lead them. And so, how many of us will be willing to commit political suicide to advocate for something? The answer is, it's a prisoner's dilemma, and it will never work that way. The people have to want it. And that's why I talk about it. I mean, I have to talk about it very carefully. And I think it's possible, but it's unfortunately, it's not possible for all politicians. Maybe they don't have the skill sets to do it or the desire. They're jaded because they've been around long enough to see how this plays out. And so it is important for groups like yours to do your best to reach millennials from just an outside perspective, a nonpartisan perspective, maybe a perspective they actually trust. And that's just chipping away at the public opinion.
Congressman, that's it. I mean, that's why we're here. Our thought is that this is a generational issue. Generational business leaders and political leaders ought to be having these conversations, and appreciate the fact that you talk about it. Not a fun thing to talk about, not one that a whole lot of millennials have engaged in to this point, but we've found that particularly among entrepreneurs, there are these questions being asked again, is this experiment headed anywhere good? Or is it just a question of at what point the reckoning comes? So as you'll partner with us, we certainly look forward to working with you and grateful for your time today.
Hey, thanks guys. Keep up the good work. Talk soon.
Thanks, Congressman. Hey guys, we're kind of moving towards halfway through the second hour here. This next session is really meant to be conversational. We're going to get a presentation that I think is going to illustrate for a lot of you. You may have some lights go off about how this stuff works. I've found Brian Riedl with the Manhattan Institute to be sort of equally brilliant and capable of talking about these things in ways that non-economists can understand. So Brian is in a lot of ways like Maya MacGuineas has advised, presidential candidates, members of the House and Senate budget committees. He was a chief economist in the U.S. Senate for a long time. Brian, thanks for joining us. And if you'll start, why don't you just paint a picture of where we're headed? I mean, I often tell people that $26 trillion in debt, it surprises some folks to hear me say this. That's not actually the problem, in my opinion. The problem is we've got no plan whatsoever from here. If anything, before the pandemic, we were entering what I call, the era of $1 trillion deficits. Mm-hmm. And now it's, that may end up being the era of $2 trillion deficits. So if you'll give us kind of the 10,000-foot view, that'd be awesome. And we'll let that lead to a conversation here. And at 11:45, Senator Joe Manchin is going to join us to wrap us up. But thanks for joining us, Brian.
Thanks, Weston. Glad to be here. Thanks, everyone. So what I'm going to do is walk through some of the scary numbers. And let me tell you, they're pretty scary. Just kind of paint the picture of where we are. So before the pandemic, we were already headed for a $1 trillion deficit this year that would gradually rise to $2 trillion per year at the end of the decade. Again, this is before the pandemic. Instead, we're going to be at $3.3 trillion this year. We've never had a $3 trillion deficit in American history before. Heck, we've never had a $2 trillion deficit before. What's amazing is half of the spending this year is borrowed. Half of it. Pretty remarkable. Federal spending this year also is $50,000 per household. Never in American history, adjusted for inflation, has Washington ever spent $50,000 for every household. So over the decade, the debt held by the public is going to double from 17 trillion to 35 trillion. At a certain point soon, we are going to pass the peak of World War II. World War II, we peaked at a debt of 106% of GDP. We're going to hit 114% of GDP by the end of the decade. So the numbers are really staggering. The difference, though, with World War II is at the end of World War II, the war ended and the debt came down. The problem we have is while we're heading towards $2 trillion deficits per year permanently and 114% in GDP debt, it's going to keep going higher permanently. And not just because of coronavirus. This debt is going to continue growing because, as Congressman Crenshaw mentioned, entitlements. Specifically, 74 million baby boomers are retiring into Social Security and Medicare. Over the next decade, it is going to take $12 trillion in general revenues just to fund full benefits, because the payroll taxes and the Medicare premiums aren't enough to pay full Social Security benefits and Medicare benefits. So we're going to need to do a $12 trillion transfer. The annual cost of these transfers is going to go from $500 billion per year this year to $1.9 trillion per year in the next decade. So if you want to know why the deficit is going to rise structurally to $2 trillion at the end of the decade, that's why. It's not the $200 billion a year in tax cuts. It's not the $200 billion a year in discretionary spending from busting the caps, although they certainly contribute. It's the $1.9 trillion cost by 2030 of filling the Social Security and Medicare shortfalls every year. Shortfalls that are growing 14% per year. The 30-year numbers are even more jarring. Last year, CBO said that we're going to face $80 trillion in budget deficits over the next 30 years. What's interesting is what it comes from. What CBO's numbers said is that Social Security and Medicare will run a combined shortfall of $103 trillion, and the rest of the budget will run a $23 trillion surplus. Let me repeat that. Social Security and Medicare will run a $103 trillion deficit, and the rest of the budget will run a $23 trillion surplus over the next 30 years. That means a debt of about 170% of GDP within 3 decades under the rosiest scenario of peace, prosperity, no new spending, and no new tax cuts. So specifically, we are facing a major debt reckoning because of Social Security. Now, one issue with all this debt is who's going to lend us all the money? Who's going to actually lend us $80 trillion over the next 30 years? Well, a lot of people say China and Japan. But China and Japan have been frozen at holding $2.2 trillion of our debt for the last 10 years. It hasn't moved. They own $2.2 trillion. That hasn't changed. As the debt goes from 20 trillion to 100 trillion over a 3-decade period, you can't expect China and Japan to bail us out. So who's going to do it? Well, of the $3.3 trillion deficit we just had this year, 60% was funded by the Federal Reserve. They monetized 60% of it, basically the printing press. 40% of it came from domestic savings, because the savings rate went from 8% to 32% because everybody was hoarding money for the pandemic. But moving forward, the Fed is not going to keep monetizing all of this debt. At least that's what they told us they do not want to. And China and Japan can't fund something this big. So that means it's all going to have to come from domestic savings, even as savings rates fall back to normal levels. So it's going to come out of business investment. It's going to come out of growth. It's going to come out of productivity. And interest rates have been low. But when you're going to have to borrow that much, it could raise interest rates. And that gets into my final point before we jump into the Q&A. What if interest rates rise? This is where it gets really scary. See, even as the debt has soared, CBO has decreased their projection of interest rates. They say interest rates will be about 1.5% over the next decade. This is miles below normal. In the 1990s, the government paid an interest rate of 6.9%. In the 2000s, 4.8%. In the decade that passed, about 2.5%. For our debt to be affordable, interest rates absolutely have to stay under 2.5% forever. Otherwise, by 2030, every point that interest rates rise is going to cost $350 billion a year. Every point, $350 billion in new interest. Because everyone with a student loan can tell you, when your debt is that big, even a small change in interest rates can make your interest payments huge. Over 30 years, every point interest rates rise will cost $11 trillion in interest. That means that if interest rates rise 1 point, that'll cost twice as much as the tax cuts. If interest rates rise 2 points, that'll cost as much as the entire Social Security shortfall. If interest rates rise 3 points, which is what most economists predict when you have the debt growing at this pace, that itself will cost $1 trillion a year by 2030 in new interest. What that means is we are essentially gambling our fiscal future on the hope that we can build the largest debt in world history without triggering any rise in interest rates ever again. Perhaps we're right. If not, we could face an economic catastrophe. And in that situation, you have rising interest rates burying the federal budget and squeezing in business investment. In that context, the new proposals that we're seeing by, say, Joe Biden, Democrats, and others to add trillions more in new spending and deficits is especially irresponsible. So here's what we should do moving forward. Number one, help relieve the recession, but without spending $1 more than is necessary. Number two, we need to resist big initiatives. The $11 trillion proposed by Biden, the $40 trillion proposed by other Dems, totally irresponsible. Third, we need to begin preparing to address long-term spending as soon as the economy is strong enough to handle it. This mostly means Social Security and healthcare. And yes, it probably means agreeing to some new revenues to get Democratic buy-in. There's really no way around it. Ernest Hemingway, in his novel The Sun Also Rises, has a character named Mike who's asked how he went bankrupt. 2 ways he answers: gradually and then suddenly. The thing about a fiscal crisis is that by the time you see it and feel it, it's too late. It's better to phase in smart reforms now rather than impose drastic reforms during a crisis. So that's the scary numbers for you. I'm happy to take questions or insults or whatever you wish from this point on.
We've got a lot of friends in South Carolina, and your accent is proof that we've also got a lot of friends in Wisconsin.
Oh, yeah, there, hey, eh?
Alejandro Mendieta had a question we didn't quite get to with Congressman Crenshaw, but I thought actually it was appropriate for this conversation here, just about Congress. Obviously, a lot of your career was spent in that body, Brian. Alejandro, go ahead.
I've been on the call today and I keep hearing the American people, and really what they're referring to, Brian, is voters. So you say Biden is irresponsible. I would actually have some more harsh words, because the reality is over half the voting population is baby boomers, it's seniors, and the average, age in the House and the Senate is late 50s, early 60s. So the reality is the millennial generation, which is what I represent, what everybody here on this commission represents, is not really heard. And I don't know if it's term limits, which I've always been criticized about. I don't know if it's having more millennials to actually go out and vote, more millennials to actually get more educated on the debt. But, I just don't see this being taken seriously when you have a generation that is willing to just kick the can to the millennials. And our average net worth right now is under $10,000. The average net worth of a baby boomer or a senior is over 25 times that amount. The reality to actually reduce the debt and take some serious responsible measures, I just don't see it. And I'd love to get your feedback on it, but I think without having millennial representation in the House, in the Senate, and really have a strong voting power and get educated, I just don't see how this is going to be taken seriously.
Yeah, I mean, that is a great point. I lecture a lot on college campuses, and I talk to a lot of students, and I tell them that the baby boomers are eating your lunch. While you guys focus on a lot of symbolic issues, you are having your pocket picked in what is the largest intergenerational transfer of wealth in world history. I mean, the reason the budget is essentially going bankrupt, and the reason it's going to squeeze all the priorities of millennials, whether it be social spending or tax relief, is because all of the money is going to senior citizens. And I say to these people, don't you realize what they're doing to you? They're distracting you on symbolic issues while they're robbing you blind. And unfortunately, the younger voters I talk to just don't get that. They have this delusion that the rich can pay for everything. The rich, my pocket's not being picked. If we just tax billionaires, they'll pay for everything. And I wrote an article in National Review about 2 weeks ago where I pointed out that the entire net worth of all of America's billionaires is $3.4 trillion. You could liquidate every penny every billionaire has, and it would close about 1/5 of the budget deficit. That's it. And of course, you'd also wipe out your retirement, because most of their wealth is in the stock market that you'd have to liquidate. But millennials, Gen Z, all the today's college students, a lot of them just think it's not my pocket being picked. It doesn't affect me. It's the billionaires can pay for it all. And I'm constantly trying to tell them, no. The way Europe funds socialism is by taxing the hell out of younger people in the middle class, payroll taxes, VATs. You're going to be the ones who are going to get taxed to death. And it's not going to be for all the neat stuff you want. It's going to be for the seniors. But until it starts to affect them directly, until we start to see the tax hikes, until we start to see the fiscal crisis, they're not going to feel it. And the downside of that is, again, by the time you feel it, it's too late. And so we keep trying to warn people, but unfortunately I haven't had a lot of success, or the problem would be solved.
Hey, we'll go to Joe Zhu in Chicago, Illinois, and then we're going to come to you, Robert, here in just a second.
Hey, Brian, thank you so much for your fantastic insight. I got a question. Certainly the U.S. government has never been a great steward of our money, and nor has it been a good investor. But in its history, it has made certain investments that have contributed to significant GDP growth, whether it be majority of them being infrastructure, but certainly, the highways, the railroads, one could argue in terms of land grants and Hatch Act, other aspects in terms of DARPA and NIH. Are there areas that you would recommend at this point, given the time that, money is cheap? Certainly we are at a low interest rate environment with zero inflation. Is there an area that the federal government is able to seize this is a good time to make this large scale infrastructure investment or this large scale technology investment to ensure this next wave of GDP growth?
I don't have a lot of faith in government investment. I think, can you hear me now? I think the government has a good track record in certain investments, like the national highway system. And there's always, some targeted investments that can help, whether it be science research, defense research, helped, create things like the internet. I would be careful doing multi-trillion-dollar investments right now because I don't think we can afford it. Unless we're willing to address spending elsewhere, the debt numbers are just too big. I would like to see us pare back some of the transfer payments, fix Social Security and Medicare, and then you can have more money for the priorities you mentioned. What worries me is interest rates are low today. We can't always assume they're always going to be low, though. And the important thing is the government does not lock in low interest rates. The government is mostly funded on short-term borrowing. So even if interest rates are low today, if they rise a year from now, we're going to have to pay the higher interest rates on our current debt. And my worry is you don't want to lock in permanent long-term debts based on temporary low interest rates, because if interest rates rise, again, you get to the point where every point interest rates goes up, it costs $330 billion. If we could lock in today's low interest rates for 30, 40 years, I would be a lot less worried about making certain investments and certain policies, but we're not locking in low interest rates, so we are totally exposed and vulnerable. So while I agree that there are certain things government can do well, we got to get total spending down. We have to address, whether it's Social Security, Medicare, in order to make room for the other expenditures. Otherwise, again, we are exposing ourselves. We're an interest rate hike away from getting demolished.
Thank you.
And we'll go to Robert Hughes in Greenville, South Carolina. Robert.
Thanks, Weston, and thank you, Brian, for being here and for your time. I greatly appreciated Congressman Crenshaw's comments about this being a cultural issue, and we had conversations earlier about it. Where civics education and civics understanding sits among the people, as everyone keeps saying, in the electorate and really the entire population. But you use a lot of big numbers that even as I sit here in the private sector and sit here saying, it's hard to grasp the size and the scope of the problem. And you got billions and trillions and deficit and deficit spending and there's so many different categories, different pieces of this that maybe everyone on this call and everyone in this world fully understands it. Even as someone studying it, I don't know that I fully grasp the context that we're in, and it seems like that's one of the problems with communicating it. It's not, everyone says we might have to wait for the big event or wait for it to be the problem for action to come. You used a really good analogy, it sounds like in one of your recent writings on liquidating all the billionaires. Are there other ways in which you have found to effectively communicate the problem or contextualize the problem and that folks can use in trying to bring this, shine a brighter light on this? Are there other ways that you know of to help fully understand the issue?
It's a great question. I'm constantly looking for ways to bring this down from econ geek speak into terms that are more relatable. I think, one that I often use is, again, you could tax every billionaire at 100%. You could eliminate all their wealth. It wouldn't be enough. One of the similar numbers I've used is that if we seized every dollar of income earned over $1 million, 100% tax rates over $1 million, and everybody kept working at 100% tax rates, you wouldn't even balance the budget. Other ways I look at it is I try to also often put spending in per household terms. This year we're spending $50,000 per household. We're taxing $25,000 per household. Even after the economy improves, or we're going to be back to spending about $40,000 per household. The question becomes, do you want to tax $40,000 per household? Can you afford to be taxed $40,000 per household? If not, what do we do? How do we get spending down? And sometimes you need to personalize it in terms of how big of a tax we would need. I put out a report recently, about a year and a half ago, that said essentially the choice we face is between either fixing Social Security and Medicare or choosing between a 30% payroll tax or a 33% national sales tax. That's essentially, if you just model out the choices, you try to put it in stark terms, either fix the entitlements or nearly double your taxes. Pick one. And putting it in per household terms like that, that's how I try to get people to relate to it. It works for some audiences, it doesn't work for others. Some others, until the crash is happening, they're not going to believe it. And it's just really hard. Sometimes we put it, Weston mentioned too, putting it in global warming terms, that it's coming. We're already seeing early signs of it. If you point out to younger individuals, millennials, Gen Z, younger individuals, it's coming and you're already starting to see it, kind of like the way you see global warming. We try that too, but it's a challenge.
We've got about 3 minutes left here. Cam Duty, who's a co-founder and chairman of Bellhop, is going to ask our last question here, and we'll wrap it up. Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, Jeff Bezos has a pretty famous stance around frugality driving innovation in the business. I mean, he's super cheap in everything that he's done at that company. Not because it's just a budgeting philosophy, but he actually believes that frugality drives innovation in the company because it forces you to work with constraints. And obviously, the U.S. government has a very different philosophy on how to innovate, has taken a very different stance. So with respect to this actually being a philosophy, where people have to change the way that they think about how to move the needle on something. I mean, where do we even begin on inciting that shift?
The challenge is a good question. The challenge right now, government can become more efficient. There's a lot that can be done there. Government can be more effective. They can figure out how to do more with less. Right now, they're not motivated to. And this is a bipartisan issue. Democrats don't see the problem. Democrats look at a lot of the deficits, the Social Security trends, and say, let's spend more. We don't need to economize as much. Republicans have pretty much for the last 5-6 years not paid much attention either. I mean, the Republican focus has been on tax cuts, for which, whether you think they're a good idea or a bad idea, they should be accompanied at least with some spending cuts or something. And there is almost no oversight happening in Congress. There's almost no economizing in Congress. There's so much waste in the federal budget. Not enough that it gets you off the hook for fixing Social Security and Medicare, but you have a government that's stretched so thin that tries to do all things to all people in all areas. Very little oversight, because they don't really see the political reward in oversight. They see the political reward in shoveling out benefits. So before you can have an economic change in Congress, you kind of need that cultural change where they actually are looking for this. Even back, I'm old, but I remember in the 1980s, we had the Grace Commission, which we brought in business leaders to figure out how to make government more efficient and more streamlined. In the 1990s, they tried doing a lot of this, but the members of Congress stopped listening. In the 2000s, we had BRAC pushing a little more, but again, members of Congress stopped listening. There are ways for government to become a lot more efficient with its resources. They need to care first. And right now, they're in the shovel benefits business. Not enough of them are really in the true oversight and efficiency business.
Brian, thanks for your time, man. We look forward to re-engaging you over the course of the coming months, and appreciate again your brilliance and ability to speak in layman's terms, so we understand the problem at hand. If I could have chosen members of the commission how to wrap up this meeting, given where we are, the national political climate, I would have chosen former West Virginia Governor and U.S. Senator Joe Manchin, and we're honored that we get to close the meeting out with him. I started this organization, the Millennial Debt Foundation, which is the lead sponsor of the commission, with the support of U.S. Senator Tom Coburn. In fact, really a lot of what we're doing here is inspired by him. Somewhat famously, Dr. Coburn, who was probably the most conservative member of the Senate, once donated personally to Joe Manchin, saying that he was one of the few guys in Washington who cared about the long-term future of the country. And I have no doubt, Senator Manchin, if we had 100 former governors in Washington who thought as independently as you do, we could, in fact, wrap our arms around these massive generational challenges. Will you bring some opening remarks, and then we'll wrap the meeting up with some questions for you, sir?
And thank you for allowing me to be with you. I am so sorry, but if you were watching the floor, I was talking to Rob Portman. We're trying to work in a bipartisan way to move this agenda forward. The people are hurting in America. People are hurting in every state. We have to make sure we meet the needs during this horrible time so that we have a successful outcome. And that means is not throwing us into a perilous down spiral. We have a medical crisis, and that's turning into a financial crisis. And as of this morning, every morning I want you to know, for all of you, first of all, the Millennial Debt Commission, it's a wonderful example of bipartisanship and what you all do. And I appreciate and respect so much the effort you put forward. I've made a mission of mine every day to look at the debt, the national debt, and also the annual debt that we're incurring. So as of this morning, I get a text. I'll give you a little bit of an oversight. This is probably better than anything I could say because I follow this every morning. Okay, let's go Thursday, last Thursday. The national debt was $26,742 billion. The deficit was $2,920 billion. Let's go Friday. National debt, $26,746 billion, went up $4 billion in one day. The annual debt was $2,921. It went up $1 billion. Then on Monday, national debt $26,758. National debt, the annual debt jumped to $3,129. $3,129 billion. This Wednesday, this morning. Okay, well, yeah, this morning. This morning, the national debt $26,766 billion. The annual debt $3,131. It goes up. It never goes down. It goes up every day. Now you want to have something every day that's the first text you get in the morning. I get it at 8:30 every morning, and it tells me where we stand as a nation. Someone's got to bring this to the attention of Democrats and Republicans to think about our country and what we're leaving to your generation and the generation after us. And right now, nobody is. Nobody's talking about it. No one's raising it. You don't hear anybody that's been in any of the primaries running for president speaking of this. The place has become so dysfunctional that we're trying to find out who's the blame game. Who can we blame and get more mileage out of blaming somebody than fixing something? So I want you all to know, in public life, the best policy, the best politics, if you're worried about your politics, if you're a Democrat or Republican, the best politics is good government. Do something that benefits the people, and everybody takes credit. You can go home and brag about it. The Democrats can go home and brag about it. The independents can brag because it's something good. People like it when things are done good, and they give everybody credit. When things are done bad, and the Democrats or Republicans says, "Oh, we're going to blame them, the other side more." Guess what? We're all in it together. They asked me this morning on national press call, who do you think this has helped or hurt? I said, first of all, it's hurt the American people. Next of all, it hasn't helped any party to have deadlock the way we have it. But you all speaking up makes a difference. And Wes, I appreciate it so much. I'm doing everything I can. Our younger generation is starting down to climate change, racial tensions, massive national debt. We got a lot on our plate right now. Things are changing. And it's going to take responsible people that will say, listen, I can do something. I can make a difference. Why in the world do we get involved in the public domain? Why do we run for office? Why are you all so interested? Why are you involved? I would assume we all care. And if you care and you're in a position to do something about it and advocate for common sense and don't demagogue anybody or any one side, we'll all be good. But right now, I've said before, I've lived in a generation when you were guilt by association. If somebody did something bad, but that might have been your friend, and you still were seen talking to that person, you were guilt by association by not condemning that person. That person's still a human being. We got to hope we can turn them around if they're your best friend. So you don't forsake them. But anyway, guilt by association. Guess what today? What your generation is growing up in? Guilt by conversation. You can't even have a conversation anymore and have good dialogue. You can't sit down and agree to disagree and walk away as friends. You can't go to family gathering and talk politics anymore because it's so toxic. This is crazy, gang. Your generation cannot tolerate that anymore. You ought to say enough's enough. For my generation, okay, and you can say this, for my parents and grandparents, start acting like a grown-up. Start acting like someone that cares about our country, that cares about me and cares about your children and your grandchildren. Start acting like you're there for a responsible reason. So I guess until the shock hits us all, that we understand it, what are we doing to your generation? What are we going to do to your children's generation? What, you know, we have a chance to turn it around. You can't carry this heavy a debt, gang. You can't carry it. You understand? We're going to have, when we hit the wall, it'll be so critical. The only thing that's keeping us afloat right now is the rest of the world's in shambles too. If other countries, and they get their finances together, and I worry about China every day, I do, and I support the president on making China basically work within the confines of a superpower, if you will, because they're coming on strong. And we've got to be aware of that. But our debt can take us down. You can ask anybody. I asked one time, I was on armed services. First question, 2010, I got here. And I asked a question to Admiral Mullins, Mike Mullins, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. What's the greatest threat the United States of America faces? Because I had been hearing and reading, and I've been in all my intel reports about all the challenges that we have from other countries that want to take us on, that want to overtake the status of the superpower of the world. I knew about all that. So I'm thinking I'm going to hear something about whether it be China, Russia, or what's going on in the Middle East. I was waiting to hear some type of a military answer. Weston, you know what the answer I got from Mike Mullen? The answer I got from Mike Mullen, the greatest threat the nation faces is the debt of this nation. It'll take us down quicker than anything else. That tells you everything. So with that, please don't ever lose basically your focus right now, the fiscal responsibility of each and every one of them. My grandfather would tell me this. He says, John, let me tell you, unencumbered debt, unmanaged debt will make cowards out of the decisions you'll make. Unmanaged debt will make cowards out of all of us. You'll make cowardly decisions when you have unmanaged debt. A country will make it, a business will make it, an individual will make it. We'll all make basically cowardly decisions. Robbing Peter to pay Paul, that just didn't happen. That saying just didn't come about. It has real meaning to it. So with that, let me just say thank you. Thank you for allowing me to come. I'm sorry. We're having votes going on right now. We're trying to get an energy bill on the floor, which we haven't gotten for 12 years. It'll be great. We're working on that in a bipartisan. And then we're trying to get a COVID relief package that helps the people of America. So we've got a few things going on right now, and we see if we can pull everybody together for the sake of our country.
Yeah, well, grateful for your time. We heard the bells go off there in the Senate. Do you have time for a couple of questions here?
How much time? Yep, in good shape. I got about 10 minutes.
All right, well, we won't take that much time. We've got a couple coming. First, I want to ask you this. You may not know that kind of our roots, the Millennial Debt Commission's roots. I launched this thing last year with the help of your former colleague, Senator Tom Coburn, who was a friend of yours and a supporter of yours.
Best of the best. Yeah.
Best of the best.
And, you know, can you believe this, Weston? As toxic as this atmosphere when Tom was still here, and I'm running for re-election in 2018, in 2012, 2018, Tom Coburn wrote me a personal campaign check contribution.
Well, the good guys have to stick together. I learned that from Dr. Coburn, but also learned that you don't get anything done in Washington unless you're willing to spend the political capital that you build up. And frankly, sir, it's one of the reasons that we're honored to have you here. We respect that you do that and are so willing to work across the aisle. Who do you sense, regardless of who the next president is, come January, middle of the year in 2021, hopefully the economy's recovering, we can begin to talk about some of these long-term issues with regard to the sustainability of our borrowing. Who do you think on your side of the aisle is willing to spend political capital to put the country in a stronger position for future generations?
Well, first of all, let's say that the Democrats take over the majority in the Senate, because it's very doable. It can happen. No matter what happens, it's going to be within 52 to 48, maybe 51, 49, whether the Democrats control it or the Republicans. So those in the middle, if the Democrats do control it and we make gains of 2 or 3 or 4, it's going to be from the moderate end, from the purple states. It's not going to be the far left progressives. Okay? It'll be from the middle. And if we can get everyone to remember where you came from and how you got here, they voted for you in a purple state because they thought you were moderate. They thought you would work across the lines and be bipartisan. Don't let this place turn you into hyper partisanship. That's the first thing I would say. So who do I think? I think we have a lot of good people. I've got basically right now that I can always work with Kristen Sinema from Arizona. She's very bipartisan, very moderate, you know. And then basically I've got Doug Jones from Alabama I work with. Doug's going to have a hard time in Alabama. We know that. But he's given it all he has. Doug would be great if he comes back because he wants to work in the middle because the people of Alabama demand him to be in the middle. They don't want you to be a hardcore left or they don't expect you to be a hardcore right either. So you have that going on. And then you have the new people coming on. If we have Hickenlooper from Colorado, if he happens to win, I understand it's a big race. Former governor. We have Bullock from Montana, former governor. Trust me, I know how a governor cannot be partisan. A governor cannot. A governor has to make decisions every day. And a governor has to look and meet the needs of its people. Around here in the Senate, you can basically almost forget about your oath of office to defend and protect the Constitution. You can almost forget about that if you don't remind yourself every day that's your purpose. And basically, you take an oath to serve everybody. I didn't take an oath just to serve the Democrats in West Virginia and the Democrats in the United States. I took an oath to serve everybody. And even so, those who basically oppose me the most, I want to make sure that I bend over backwards to be fair with them. So I have a lot of that going on. I have about 6 or 8. I've got Michael Bennett in Colorado is very reasonable, very responsible. I've got, and I know you'll find this hard to believe, but Chuck Schumer, even though he's the leader now, because he has to, you hear him out there beating the banner and waving the flag, but Chuck, look at the diversity of New York. Don't worry about the second bell. It always goes off like that. The diversity of New York. Chuck can't be far left because basically upstate New York won't let him be far left. They've got to work. When you look at a state, someone that represents a hot blue or hot red area or hot blue state or hot red state, they pretty much can move to the extremes and still be electable. So look for that. And the moderates right now, I've got good people. I work with Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski on the other side, very close. Rob Portman, very close. A lot of good friends, John Cornyn, John Thune, all of them. And right now, it's going to go ahead, Wes.
Well, if we can get a few rapid fire to be respectful of your time, we do have a few members of the commission who want to ask questions. We'll go to Rachel Neal, who's a commissioner from Wisconsin first. Rachel.
Hi, thanks so much. I really have enjoyed hearing your viewpoint, and I'll go quick here. So I had a question, actually, as you brought up China and people getting along and all of this. So China holds over $1.1 trillion of our national debt. Do you think that this significantly impacts our ability to hold them accountable over human rights, intellectual property, trade imbalance abuses? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay, China. Well, here's what with China. In a perfect world, don't worry about China's debt because China depends on us more for a consuming market, for all the things they do to employ their people and their economy. So it's a tit for tat. We both get hurt. Now, if the trade war escalates to the point to where China says, "Hey, we're going to basically explore other options around the world because we can't count on the United States to consume the amount of products we want them to consume," then we have a problem. They can start calling that in. Then that means you have inflation going up if someone else doesn't step forward and buy that debt. That's what you have to worry about, the backlash we have there. So the trade war, there has to be a balance. We have to always be talking, trying to negotiate through. The main thing that we're trying to get China on a fair level playing field. You can't be stealing our intellectual properties. You can't continue to do what you have done to accelerate your economy and your standing in the world based at our demise. We won't let that happen. They respect none of that whatsoever, and we've got to make sure that they understand. And militarily, we've got to be strong to hold them accountable. They can't take over the passageways of the China Sea. They just can't do it. We can't let them do it. So there's things there. How far do we push? Trust me, their people now have come out of a third world status. It's quicker than any other I've ever seen. They're going to demand more. You know that. Once you're exposed, once you have access, not only are you appreciative at first, then you expect it later on as it continues to be there. You're not going to go backwards. You don't want to go back to where you were before. No electricity, no refrigerator, no this, no convenience. So they're going to push back. And with a billion plus people, we've got to count on that. Look what's happening in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a perfect example of what can happen all over China. And we've got to be careful how we balance that out too. But the bottom line is, I'm counting on the rising social status of the Chinese in mainland China to speak up and say enough's enough. And for us to be fair with them, not to be unreasonable. But I'm not worried about them calling their debt in on us.
Very quickly, Alejandro Mendieta in Miami, Florida. Alejandro.
Hi, Senator.
I hope that helped, Rachel.
My question is really not to go so much into the debt or any of the other serious issues we have, Senator, but what I've seen across both parties, Democrats and Republicans, is a frustration of reelection, the pressure of reelection. If we were to perhaps maybe, make our terms a lot longer, but just one-time terms, do you feel that that would be more beneficial and productive going forward to get things done in the Senate? House?
Well, there's a couple things I think that need to be done. First of all, Citizens United, which allowed so much outside money and so much hidden money or dark money, that has to be eliminated. Both sides, and Democrats will condemn it more, but trust me, both sides like it. They both like it. So that's a sacrifice that needs to be made for the sake of the country. Because I can tell you, money's coming in. I never seen this much money pour in. Now, you can just tell about all the money coming in, the dark money, the 501c6s, of what's going on. Okay, the independent, the IEs they call them. You can basically run a campaign on modest means because the IEs, if they think you're a player, they'll come in and pick up the slack. You have no idea where it's coming from. And that's what's wrong. It should be, if I'm running against you and I, it should be us basically raising our resources because of the policies we believe in and our politics. That's all. But right now, I've never seen anything like this. So it's toxic as can be, and how do you change it? Well, first of all, there should be term limits. I believe in term limits. I don't believe anyone should be here more than 12 years. I believe that you ought to have your head examined and have a psychological exam if you want to stay longer. Something's wrong because you can't take it. The human mind couldn't take this. So with that being said, that means 12 years for a senator, 6 2-year terms for a House member. That should be the max and turn things over. Next of all, there should be an ethics violation against any sitting senator or congressperson campaigning against another sitting congressperson or senator. We shouldn't be able to go out and beat up on our colleagues. How can you expect us to work across the aisle every day and on the weekends go home and try to beat them? Go to their home state. Stupid. Or give your opponent money. It could be Donald Duck running against a Democrat or Republican. If you're on the other side, they'll be for Donald Duck. They don't care. I won't do it. So those are some things you all should push for the ethical changes that makes this place work. Common sense. Amen. Don't let us campaign against each other. Put term limits on it to make it reasonable so that people will have a little bit of faith that it's about them and not about us.
Hey, we'll wrap up with this from the Commonwealth of Kentucky, just next door to you. Asa Swan James, and then we'll let you go, Senator. Very grateful for your time.
How much time? Okay, I'm okay. Yeah, let's go. Asa, how are you? How's everything in Kentucky?
It's doing great, sir. Thank you very much. It's a hello from your neighbors next door. First, I just want to thank you for your independent spirit. It's very encouraging, and I'm sure you take a lot of heat for it. My question, sir, is about your caucus. I just wondered, can you tell us a little bit about the read you get on your colleagues in the Democratic caucus about how they feel about balancing the budget? Thank you.
there's not a lot of conversation. It's like I'm talking to an empty suit. And that's on both sides. My friends on the Republican have always talked. I said, you know, God bless you all. You all talk a good game, but I've seen you throw caution to the wind. You did tax cuts that we knew was going to be $1.5, maybe $2 trillion of debt. Okay. And I would have said this. I said, okay, maybe you're right. I'll give you a perfect example. 35% corporate rate, right? Corporate rate taxes, 35% in America. I thought 25%, and every corporation I talked to would have been able to have been perfectly happy with 25. For every 1%, that's $100 billion when you cut them. So you can imagine what we did there. And I said, that makes no sense at all. And I said, next of all, if you want to go to 21, if you want to do reductions in a systematic way. Because I always tell you, if we do this, the economy's going to take off and we'll have more than we can, right? You always hear that. One will offset the other. Well, then why don't you do this? Why don't you wait till they crisscross? Wait till the curve crisscross before you do it. So as you do it gradually, you can see if what you said is true. If I'm reducing taxes and I'm seeing the economy and increases of the economy that offset the taxes I've decreased, when they've crisscrossed, I can continue to go down. If they don't level out, I stop. And within a period of time, then automatically it would raise back up to the previous levels if we can't pay our bills. It makes common sense to me. That's how you run. You ever look at I'm sure you look at your checkbook, look at your bank accounts. You got to figure out, wait a minute, there's more going out than coming in. Something's going to happen here pretty soon. I'm going to get a phone call. That's about it. And they all talk it, but we don't live it when it comes to it because we justify what you want. And when you have your own printing press next door and just say, hey guys, buy more paper and get more ink because by God, we're letting it rip now. We need it. And they're able to do that. State budgets, why governors are good, every week we sat down with our financial people and had to make adjustments to basically balance the budget. We had to bite the bullet every week if we needed to. That's the difference. And we should have a balanced budget amendment and only break that balanced budget in time of crisis or war.
Senator, thank you again.
Hey, Weston, that's another one. Get on that one. I'd love to work with you on some of this stuff that I can tell you makes sense and make this place work.
Well, we'll take you up on that offer, and grateful that you adjusted in the middle of a busy day in the Senate to speak with us.
I'm sorry that I held you all up, and I'm thankful you all hung right in there. And Jane, and I see Tianji and everybody else. Thank you all. Sorry I didn't get to
thank you. Well, thanks to your team, and thanks for your independence in the U.S. Senate. We'll be in touch with you. Thank you, sir. Commissioners, I'll follow up with you. Thanks for all your time and your patience. And we'll do this again late November when we know who the next president is going to be. Thanks, y'all.